Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Blake Truitt, the Atlantic's Executive Director of Foundation Relations.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Blake Truitt, Executive Director of Foundation Relations at The Atlantic, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Race and Justice Summit at the Atlantic Festival. This event is part of a series of discussions the Atlantic has hosted in communities across the country, from Charlotte to Portland, Los Angeles to Houston, that has explored our changing criminal justice system. We've looked at local efforts to reduce jail populations, reform bail, and create more fair and just communities. These local efforts shape and advance our national conversation about the American justice system. Today, we'll hear about the power of prosecutors, bail reform initiatives, the role of data in administering justice, and the difference that education can make in the lives of the formerly incarcerated. We'll also meet an inspiring artist using his platform for social change. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the MacArthur Foundation's Safety and Justice Challenge for their support of the Atlantic Festival and for making today's conversation possible. I'd also like to thank the National Portrait Gallery for their use of this wonderful space today and ask Kim Sayet, the Executive Director of the Gallery, to say a few words.
Welcome to the Smithsonian Institution and this, your National Portrait Gallery. So, is democracy dying? Not if you consider the best of today's artists, whom I would suggest are like the canaries in the coal mine, warning us of changes to the social structure and the mood of the people. The artist's role is to observe their surroundings, highlight beauty when they can and ugliness when they must. Connecting people to each other through the very act of being human and giving power to free expression, not just privilege. If you were to look in our galleries right now, you would see both. Those who traditionally had their portrait made, white men who owned land, and those whose presence was literally erased. The Blackout Silhouette exhibition focuses on the dichotomy of black versus white, not just in terms of white paper and black shapes, as demonstrated by this month's Atlantic cover, but the practice of keeping select histories in the dark. To see the 18th century silhouette of Flora, a 19-year-old enslaved woman profiled, for this is where the term derives, next to her bill of sale, for example, juxtaposed next to Cara Walker, who is, by the way, a MacArthur Fellow, her 2013 installation of, quote, savages and civilians, is to draw a straight line from the racism of the past to today. As Jill Lepore, Emeritus Board Member of this museum, in her astounding new book, These Truths, writes, quote, stories are full of power and force. They seethe with meaning, with truth and lies, evasions and honesty. Speech often has far more weight and urgency than writing. But perhaps more memorable, I would suggest, is art. Art, to paraphrase Picasso, is a lie that illustrates the truth. And if you have a moment, walk through the Unseen, Our Past in a New Light exhibition to see the paintings of Titus Kavar, who questions the power structure behind the United States, especially the president's. And I'm thrilled to announce that just today he was awarded a MacArthur Fellow. And in this month's magazine, much to everyone's not really talking to each other, this picture is in our galleries. Titus's picture is in our gallery. I'd love to say that we were coordinated, but that would not be true. I also would encourage you to look at the historical photographs of Ken Gonzalez Day, also in the Unseen exhibition, who in removing the bodies of Mexican Americans lynched on the West Coast in order not to re-victimize the victims, forces us to confront the grinning faces of the violent mobs who posed for their pictures and sent souvenirs home to families and friends. We as a country cannot just intellectualize and act, we also have to feel. To employ visual artists, musicians and performers, writers, poets and filmmakers to connect the logos to the pathos as outlined in Jeffrey Goldberg's introduction of this month's magazine, but also the mythos the mystery and the unboundedness of the human spirit, to step outside of the comfort zones and be confronted and uncomfortably reminded that the portrait of America has never only been about meritocracy, but also about social access, racial inequality, gender difference, religious preference, and political power. As we approach Columbus Day, increasingly being recognised as a day of Indigenous lamentation that prophetically coincides with the 50th anniversary of this museum's opening in 1968, we need to remember that we did not find a new world, but invaded an old one. We weren't just a world leader, but a global participant. And in the end, as we all enter this world with nothing, and we leave this world with nothing, it's what we all do in the middle that's going to count. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. A few quick notes you're likely already familiar with. Please silence your phones, but keep them handy to tweet using the hashtag #TheAtlanticFest. And we'll want to hear from you in the room as we take some questions near the end of the discussion. And with that, please welcome Wesley Bell, the Democratic candidate for prosecutor in St. Louis County. Miriam Aroni-Krinsky, Executive Director of Fair and Just Prosecution. And here to lead the discussion is my colleague, Atlantic Senior Editor Ron Brownstein.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for joining us. So Wesley, let me start with you. I know no candidate likes to get ahead of themselves, but if you are elected in November and you become the county prosecutor, any elected official has only limited political capital, only so many things they can do in the time they have. What is on the top of your list that you think will have the most impact in creating a more equitable criminal justice system?
You know, the things that we actually ran on in our platform, and one of those things are expanding diversionary programs, drug treatment programs, mental health treatment programs. We know one of the biggest contributors to the crime as we see it today is our drugs. I think close to 80 to 85% of people coming in contact with the criminal justice system are in need of some type of drug treatment, indirectly or directly related to drugs. And also starting to address and reevaluate the cash bail system. I think those are two things that, now obviously with the latter, there's going to have to be buy-in with the bar, the judicial, with the judges. But I think that that's part of the educational component, and I think working with them, and we have models that have worked around the country, including right here in D.C.
Right here in D.C., right?
So I think those are two things that I hope to hit the ground running.
Miriam, you've worked with a lot of DAs and prosecutors around the country. Where are you finding people generally are putting most of their chips?
Well, so I think the sorts of issues that Wesley raised are reflective of sort of this new mood that we find ourselves in. And I think as a starting point, what we're seeing among these new, exciting, bold leaders is that they are starting at a different place. They're owning more. They're accepting the starting point that we can't criminalize our way out of poverty, out of mental illness, out of substance abuse. They are vastly committed to shrinking the size of the criminal justice system. And when questions like you just posed, Ron, to them are posed to them, they don't talk about convictions, indictments, prosecutions, punishing our way into a safer and healthier community. They talk about where the justice system needs to disengage. And I think that's a fundamental shift and an exciting.
Let's talk about that. Is obviously, I think one of your goals is to reduce the number of people who are processed through the criminal justice system. What are the most important levers to do that? Is it diversionary programs? I mean, how do you reduce the number of people who are touched by the system?
Well, I think that, and I don't think I have to I'm not saying anything that many people don't know, but the prosecutor, and one thing that I learned early in my legal career is the vast power of the prosecutor, which is the theme, hint, hint, right? And when you start looking at ending that cycle of incarceration and offering treatment, well, those individuals who receive the treatment are significantly less likely to reoffend. Our biggest demographic of offenders are reoffenders. And so if we start addressing that population, well, we'll really start looking at making an impact in mass incarceration, because many start with that, and that cycle starts with drugs, drug abuse, and things of that nature. So I think that's a really impactful way to start bringing those numbers down.
Just to underline one thing, you said a majority of offenders are reoffenders?
The largest demographic of offenders are reoffenders. Yeah. Exactly. 75%. Wow. Recidivism rate.
So if the goal, as you say, for many now is not measured, historically, you get what you measure, right? And that theory, it was convictions and the number of people put away. In many ways, the goal now is to reduce the number of people who come through the system. Where are some places that you see progress on that occurring, and what are the lessons from them?
Right. Well, I think we are slowly starting to see a shifting tide. I think we're seeing significant changes in Cook County, in Chicago, where a recent elected leader, Kim Foxx, is doing things differently. I think we're seeing in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, in a short period of time, having accepted, some fundamentally different starting points. We can look to Seattle, where there's been a prosecutor in place, Dan Satterberg, for some time. Dan recently announced that they will no longer charge drug possession cases below a certain amount, essentially, as a prosecutor, using his power to decriminalize.
And we were in Houston recently where
Kim
similar kind of decision. Let me ask you this. I mean, Wesley, as you embody, the movement for reform is moving from the outside increasingly to the inside. And if you do become the county prosecutor, what are the biggest challenges to trying to change the system from inside? Because the angle is very different than when you are a critic on the outside.
Well, there's a culture that's been in place for, we've had the same prosecutor for 27, close to 30 years. And so there's a culture. There are those who have received promotions based on that culture. There is a law enforcement model in many jurisdictions where they have been doing it a certain way. And people are often resistant to change. It's just part of the nature of the beast. And so I think that changing that culture and educating people on the need to do that is probably going to be the biggest hurdle, because, if you've been in your position for 10, 15 years, that takes work. It takes a resolve of willingness to change the way you've been doing something for a long period of time. And so people
is that always possible? I mean, I'm thinking about Houston, where I believe she dismissed a big chunk of the upper management of the office. What are you seeing? Can you change the culture, or do you have to change the people more often than not?
I think you have to change both.
You have to change both?
It starts at the top, and not everyone, as Wesley indicated, is going to go along. I think you have to realize that you try to win hearts and minds, but the resistance is going to be strong. And let's also bear in mind that there are many interests who have a financial interest in the status quo, a financial interest in keeping prison doors open, a financial interest in a bail system that keeps a bail industry in place through cash bail. So the winds blowing against change are going to be strong, but I think that if you provide a blueprint for a better way to do things that works. I mean, we have seen that these strategies make a difference, and communities are healthier and stronger as a result of it.
But when I said your angle of vision is different in the job, also the constituency that you're serving is different. Once you are the county prosecutor, you'll be the prosecutor for the entire county. And there are a lot of people in the county whose principal interest about the criminal justice system is not really how many people are incarcerated or not, it's whether they feel safe or not. Right. I mean, there are a lot of voters who kind of look at it through that lens. And I'm wondering, how do you balance your need for reform? How do you convince them that that is not going to be in tension with their desire to be safe?
Well, first I have to respond to Miriam's point. For any of the prosecutors listening in the office, I'm not necessarily saying that you got to go. We'll set clear expectations, and we'll give people an opportunity to get on board. I don't want to send panic through the office. But I think what's important is we have to, I think the community engagement piece, and one thing that I'll take for the rest of my days as the city councilman in Ferguson was the need for that community engagement component so people would feel buy-in, so they understand not only is this what we intend to do, but we want to get your input on it as well. And I think that'll be an important component in starting to change those hearts and minds when people understand the facts behind what we're doing and how effective and impactful it can be in keeping them safer.
I was going to say, do you believe that reform and safety are in tension, or are they complementary?
I think they complement one another. And I think that we're seeing that when we implement diversionary programs and get at the root of the problem, we see our recidivism rates go down. We see our crime rates go down because the same individuals who would start progressing to more violent crimes are now getting the treatment that they need. They're getting the job skills that they need, which I intend to embed in our programs, and they are significantly less likely to reoffend. So I think those two things go hand in hand. But it's, but you have to get buy-in. You have to sell it to the.
This may be a good time to ask you about the organization that you started. I mean, the right backdrop, fair and just prosecution. After 15 years as a federal prosecutor, what did your own experiences teach you about the balance between equity on the one hand and safety on the other?
Right. Well, I sort of had the benefit of an intervening 15 years between my days as a prosecutor and this work. And so I prosecuted during the 80s and 90s, and what I saw were increasing and escalating penalties, harsher rhetoric, less discretion to really do right by the individual, and it wasn't working. Communities weren't simply becoming safer, they weren't feeling safer. And Ron, you earlier referenced feelings and perceptions of safety. If our community trusts law enforcement, if they feel safe, that's probably more important than what the crime numbers show. So what I saw was generations of individuals that we were throwing into the justice system, and it wasn't benefiting any of us. So I left that work to engage on behalf of advocacy for young people, 30,000 young people in the juvenile justice and child welfare system, but wanted to return to this work and with fair and just prosecution, feel the moment is now. We have this new normal in the field of prosecution that's coming about. And so our organization tries to make it, for Wesley and others, be a less lonely place, to bring them together, to provide them opportunities to learn, to bring their collective voice together so that they can speak out on issues of national import, and to really lift up this moment that we're in and be able, in addressing what I think is another challenge, how the community understands prosecutors and these issues, to lift up a deeper understanding of just how important prosecutors are and why we need to be supporting those who are bringing a broadened and more nuanced and more thoughtful vision to their job.
Wesley, thank you. You mentioned the culture. And I remember under the previous administration, when President Obama was still president, there were many local reformers who thought that the hammer, the potential of federal action, was an important lever to try to drive change at the local level, particularly in policing practices. Now that has essentially been withdrawn. I mean, under Jeff Sessions, Justice Department is out of that business for all intents and purposes. How does that change the equation for someone like you coming in? Does it change your ability to create momentum for change?
I think that momentum is and will be in the same place, and that starts on the local level. It starts with the public engagement component. For too long, we've had prosecutors that sit in their offices, and their offices are more case processors, as opposed to what I advocate is having prosecutors who are assigned geographically, so they get to know the communities that they serve, and so I think that we can't depend on the executive branch, the federal government, at the whim of whoever that is at the particular time. That's something that we have to do on the ground. That's something that we have to continue to educate individuals about. Because the tough part about being a prosecutor is you're always that one bad set of facts from being in hot water. You give someone a drug treatment and they go out and commit a heinous act, and so now you're under fire. When in reality, these initiatives work, big picture, but that one issue will run in social media.
I was going to ask you about that later, but let me ask there now. I mean, in terms of the political space to do this, you may have 100 people who you let out on a diversion program, and they are less likely to come back. But it's hard to measure things that didn't happen, and then something does. How robust a political space are the reform prosecutors finding for what they do, and how vulnerable are they to exactly the scenario that Wesley just outlined?
Well, I think the space is growing, and it needs to grow more, and they are still vulnerable by virtue of sort of that one Willie Horton example. I think what we need to do is build up the resilience to inoculate against that one case that goes bad by deepening the understanding, the stories, the human faces of those cases that go right, the individuals who are given a second chance, and how that impacts their lives, their families, and the community. The individuals that we don't treat as harshly, that we divert from the justice system, that we don't criminalize because they're struggling with human conditions that are better attended to in the public health system as opposed to the criminal justice system.
And Wesley, you were saying before, if I understood correctly, it's not only an equity argument. There's a self-interest argument for voters in that if there are fewer people going through the system, there will be fewer recidivists, and ultimately there will be greater public safety. I mean, that is... Yeah, and that's the case.
And there are arguments that can be made to individual constituents with respect to, from an economic standpoint. Well, part of St. Louis County is 1.1 million people, so there are a lot of people who are more economic, their issues are economic. And these things save us taxpayer dollars. When you look at diversion as opposed to incarceration, when you look at the long-term effects of implementing these programs and starting to end mass incarceration, these things have an economic, are an economic windfall, if you will. But also, when you look at our crime rates, again, it's about recidivism rates. And so, my position has and always will be that, and I'm going to digress just briefly, so bear with me, but it's the career politicians that can sometimes be the problem, and here's why. When your when your career is based on re-election because you don't have anything to fall back on, you are more susceptible to having to calculate that into your decision making, as opposed to those who have something to fall back on. Well, now we can make decisions with a clear conscience. I love what I do. I teach at a local college. I work with young people, and so if at some point down the road voters tell me to go sit down, I'm happy going back to working with young people, and so I can navigate in a manner that I think is best, and I think is better for our community at large, and I can deal with the consequences. But having said that, you still have to worry about that other side of it. Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, there have been a number of these reform prosecutors elected around the country, but you did hit a speed bump this year in California, Alameda, Sacramento, Riverside, San Diego. All 4 cases, primaries, reform challenges were defeated in primaries. What lessons did you take from that in terms of what it requires to build a kind of critical mass willing to pursue change?
So I actually think that what happened in California was positive if you look at it at a higher altitude. Vast majority of incumbent DAs are reelected and never even challenged. So there's not even a conversation around criminal justice and its impact, the impact of prosecutors on their community. So what we saw in California was the conversation happened, and more voters voted down ballot. They engaged. They didn't ignore the races. So I think what we're seeing more and more is the community has an appetite for prosecutors who care more about doing the job right as opposed to being reelected. They care more about embracing the fact that they're seeing people at their worst day And how do we understand that and internalize that?
Is part of the challenge changing who votes and engaging different voters who have not been part of the conversation?
And I want to add to Miriam's point first. And one thing that we noticed when we were campaigning is that we did not have to start. We were able to start at higher levels with our talking points. People are more aware of these issues of mass incarceration, of the need for criminal justice reform. And so we were able to talk at a higher level as opposed to having to start from ground zero and explain everything. And I think that we had an advantage there because we had an incumbent who was not used to running and having to explain and defend his positions. And so we took advantage of that. We instigated these conversations. We forced these kind of conversations, and I think that awareness plays to the benefit of a lot of people around the country.
Let me ask you, and we'll go to the audience in a moment. I want to ask you, I've asked you about kind of the challenge of reaching out to the voters and the internal constituencies that are skeptical of reform. Let me ask you about the flip side. I mean, you come out of a community that has become, a strong advocate strongly advocating for reform. Do you worry that you're going to have to disappoint reform? How do you deal with your former comrades in arms?
Well, you don't get in politics if you think you're never ever going to disappoint people. That's just that's just going to happen. But I think the goal is to do what's right. And the narrative was when I talked about when we would talk about bail reform, cash bail reform. I can't tell you how many people said, he's just going to release everyone. No, that's not quite what we're talking about here. And so you're always going to have to deal with that. And I think the more that you focus on the engagement, the more that you focus on being visible and getting that message out, the more you have surrogates in the community that will push that narrative for you. But that starts with being visible. That starts with communication.
To what extent have the reform prosecutors been able to hold the support of the groups that help propel them?
I think that, as Wesley said, it's probably not always about holding their support. It's about informing them of what you're doing and why, engaging them in the conversation, and being willing to do what's right, whether you have their support at all times or not. And in many ways, I think what we're hearing from communities is the process matters more to them than the result. Feeling that they're part of the conversation and not shut out is what they're yearning for, as opposed to a prosecutor who's always going to walk lockstep with them.
Valuing their input as well. As you make policies, let stakeholders be a part of that process so that they have buy-in. So if it doesn't work, then they're not pointing their finger at you. They're looking at, okay, this is something we did that didn't work, and that's a lot easier to fix.
The way your predecessor handled the shooting in Ferguson was obviously central to all of this. I should have asked you earlier, how will you deal with police shootings as prosecutor?
Well, I've been clear. I think that you have to have special prosecutors when you are dealing with particularly police shootings. There is too close of a relationship between the prosecutor's office and law enforcement. And I can just use that from my own experience as a municipal court prosecutor. I work with officers all the time. Matter of fact, Clay Farmer, where you at, Captain Farmer? He's in here somewhere. He's one of the people that I've gotten to know very well. One of my best friends. And so, if someone said that, hey, he's been accused of excessive force, well, Farmer's different. I probably believe it with him. But most officers, I'm joking.
He's now left, Wesley.
That's my ride too.
Yeah. The metro's over there.
But it would be difficult for me to believe that about a friend of mine. And so I think that you have to take that off the table. And so that's what I intend to do. We're going to, and one thing we didn't talk about, transparency, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, but creating policies, letting the public know what those policies are. So when a situation like that, God forbid it does happen again, you already see the scorecard. You already see how we're going to handle that situation, and we're transparent, and that's what we follow.
Let's bring in the audience. Do we have microphones? And we have a question.
Hi, my name is Ariel Guerrero. Thank you both. So I'm glad we kind of started to talk about the police involved kind of component. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the role prosecutors can play around police union contracts. So I think, right, there's a big part of that plays into how investigations happen, right? A lot of the pieces that I think place some constraints from just from a bully pulpit standpoint, or just what that may look like from your side on what the prosecutor's role might be in that.
You know, one thing that I always try to make clear, because you don't want to disappoint people, you want to, if you let them know ahead of time what your policies are, is that I think being honest with your constituents is important, and that starts with explaining to them that I can't just dictate to police officers what they do. I can't do that. Having said that, I can influence behavior by the cases that I take or that I don't take. And one thing that I'll talk about on the municipal level, we would see in St. Louis, Ferguson, we would see officers write tickets for failure to register, failure to get an inspection, expired plates. These are all the same tickets, essentially. And so when I came in, I told them, look, if you're going to write 5 tickets for the same thing, I'm dismissing 4 of them. I can't stop them from writing them, but they got tired of wasting paper, and so they would start writing the 1 ticket. And so I think that on that same vein, we can influence the behavior by the types of cases that we take. And I think the prosecutor has a unique role in educating and training young officers as well. In the warrant office, when young officers come in, and my father's a retired police officer, and one thing that he always told me was that exchange made him a better officer, because they would grill him on what he did wrong, what he didn't do wrong, the questions that he should be asking, and now the next case he would have those things in mind. So I don't know what kind of impact we can have in there and with respect to the union and on that level, but we can influence and use that bully pulpit to influence behavior in a positive way.
Let's squeeze in one more question from the audience. We have a mic over here and a mic over there. Okay. Well, there you go.
Hello, I'm Vivian Nixon, and I'm from New York City. And we have been doing some things in New York City to mitigate against the preponderance of incarceration, especially in communities of color, trying to get young people off of Rikers Island, no longer drug testing probationers for marijuana. Eric Gonzalez is trying to do really great things in Brooklyn. But my concern is, while all these things are great, at the policy level, that the thing that we cannot change or have not had a real conversation about is how do you stop the implicit and explicit bias, racial bias, that goes into putting more black and brown bodies in prison.
Can I maybe offer a couple thoughts and then Wesley turn over? And I am so glad you asked that. You know, I think the first thing we need to do is call it out and not be afraid to have those conversations. I think we need offices and leaders of offices who are more reflective of our communities. I think we need prosecutors and DAs who aren't going to simply say that's a policing problem. I mean, it is in part a policing problem, where we police, who we police, but it's also, we know those disparities deepen when cases come into a prosecutor's office. We need data that looks at it, and we need DAs that are going to own that issue and attend to those disparities.
And I would add, in one of my favorite quotes, Nelson Mandela said, "Education is the most powerful weapon that you can use for change." And so myself, as well as some of my colleagues, we facilitate implicit bias trainings, which I fully intend my office will be trained on consistently. Additionally, I think we can offer those kind of trainings for law enforcement. And for example, in Ferguson, that's one of the things that we implemented was mandatory implicit bias training. You're not seeing that in every other department, but I think that it's important. And you know, so that is a tough one. But and I do agree with Miriam's point that it also requires diversity, and not just racial diversity, but diversity of experience, education at the policy level, to start identifying these issues and addressing them, because that's a tough one, because most people don't recognize that they have implicit bias. And I could probably ask this crowd who all believes that they have some implicit bias, and there'd be some people who wouldn't raise their hand when we all do. We all do, and that training is what helps us deal with and recognize.
Well, sorry, we gotta stop here. Join me in thanking Wesley and Miriam for a terrific panel. Thank you. All right, I think we go this way.
And now, a session produced by the MacArthur Foundation. Please welcome Arthur Reiser, Director of Criminal Justice Policy at R Street Institute, and Lori Garducki, Director of Criminal Justice at the MacArthur Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lori Garducki. I direct the Criminal Justice Program at the MacArthur Foundation. We thank you for joining us for a series of very important conversations on a very timely topic in our society. At MacArthur, one of our big bets is the Safety and Justice Challenge, our initiative to change the way America thinks about and uses jails. There are nearly 11 million jail admissions annually. This is very much a local problem that requires local solutions, but it's national in scope. And I want to talk to Arthur about why conservatives should care about the justice system at the front door. MacArthur's been focusing on unnecessary, unwarranted use of incarceration, particularly how it impacts low-income and minority communities. What's the conservative right's take on these issues?
Yeah, I think that there are four pillars within the conservative movement that kind of defined why I believe we should be leading the way when it comes to jail reform and the front end of the criminal justice system at large. And the first one is, at the heart of conservatism is the idea that you are suspicious of the government. And very suspicious of the government. You know, I would privatize sidewalks if I could. And I believe that in my heart that you cannot be a limited government if you are a government that's acting arbitrarily and capricious against its people. And we know that happens in the criminal justice system. I think the second reason why I believe conservatives should be leading the way on this, and why my team leads, I think we lead the way on this, is because we're all about public safety. That's the mantra that we constantly sing, is public safety. But what we're doing now doesn't actually make us safer. We know that if you put somebody who's low risk in jail for just a couple of days, their chances of committing new crimes go up. We actually make our communities more dangerous by detaining people who shouldn't be detained. I think the third reason is it's fiscally irresponsible. And for the money hawks out on my side of the spectrum, it's crazy to me that this is not something they champion. In Texas, they spend $1.5 million a day incarcerating people who are low risk. That is $62,000 an hour. So $103,000 by the time you all leave here today was spent in the state of Texas incarcerating people who are low risk. And we can debate what low risk means, but pretty much means that your chances of committing a new crime are low and your chances of coming back to court are very high. And I think the third, and for me probably the most important, is just the morality of it. We believe in a government that believes in judicial due process, and by detaining people who are innocent, who very often will plead guilty to avoid the horrors of war, I believe is something we should be in front of. And for the conservative right individuals out in the universe, I always say that Jesus had a really rough time in pretrial detention, and this really should be something that we're leading the way on. I mean, if this is who your role model is, why can't this be a way that we think about our citizens? And these are our citizens.
Well, I want to push you a little further on that, in that you raised some of the points at which the conservatives and more progressive folks can often agree with respect to an unfair and an unjust system. But I haven't heard as much from the right, if you pardon the expression, the conservative right, as opposed to other rights, about the legitimacy of the system, confidence in the system, and the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on people of color. How do you address the issues of the disparate impact on those individuals and those communities?
I think first and foremost is we call it what it is. We have some institutional racism in the system, and we need to address those things. I mean, modern conservatives come from the party of Lincoln. where we based our principles off of freedom and equity and justice. And now what I see very often is people on the right running because they believe that the criminal justice system is some kind of boogeyman that's going to murder their children. We have to lead the way on this because it's not only conservative ideals like I just reached out, but also because it actually, the math works out for us. We actually save money. We actually have safer streets. So why don't I believe there are more conservatives on the journey with me? I think they're afraid. I think fear drives a lot of what Donald Trump is president of the United States. And he's president of the United States because of fear. And I think that there's a lot of people on the right that wrongly echo that sentiment. And I write and I pray and I push to pull people to the right side of the right.
So
I just made that up.
Okay. So the racial and social and economic justice elements of this also resonate with the conservative right. You've taught me to distinguish among the different rights. So if there is this ideological spectrum that endorses criminal justice reform, what makes you hopeful about actually making progress?
Yeah. I think that because we're actually seeing reform take place in red states, not so much on the front end of the criminal justice system, but on the back end and actual incarceration rates and rates of punishment, much of that has been led in the red states. You saw Texas, Louisiana just passed a pretty comprehensive reform bills, and it's working. Texas lowered crime and built less prisons. Not a perfect reform system in Texas by any stretch of an imagination, but they had truly led the way when it comes to saving money and reducing crime. And they did it using conservative principles. And I think that a lot of conservatives mistake leniency with being soft on crime. No, it's about good policy. And good ideas are good ideas no matter where they come from, whether it comes from the right or the left. And the fact that you're seeing these implemented in the red states and they're working at the local level, at the state level, I don't know what's happening at the federal level, but it's having a direct impact. People are being freed. People are having jobs. And one point that I like to raise is, I remember a day where conservatives believed in family, and we shouted it from the rooftops. But when it comes to criminal justice system, we don't talk about those families. When you pull a father out of a home, it impacts his wife, his children, his employer, and the ripple effect is generational. And if we can get a hold of that and stop that, I believe that not only will we have better policy, but we'll actually grow the conservative movement. And I know some people are like, well, I don't want to do that. But well, hold on a second. But I mean, if you just look at the demographics of the United States, things are changing. If we, as an ideology, do not get ahead of this, we're not only doomed for extinction, but bad ideas are just going to percolate, and we're going to be less safe.
So tell me about some of those practical solutions. You know, MacArthur, the Safety and Justice Challenge, it's in 40 jurisdictions across the country in 25 states, and small jails like Campbell County, Tennessee, large jails like Los Angeles County. What are those practical innovations? Is it technology? Is it better decision makers like the prosecutors we just had out here? Bail reform? What's on your list?
All of the above, but I really like to focus on policing because that is when the rubber meets the road. And I'm a former police officer, and I have put handcuffs on people. And when the rubber meets the road, that is where citizens are injected with the criminal justice system. And so, trying to change policing and the environment of policing in the United States, I think, is really important. And we over-police communities of color. We over-prosecute communities of color. We disinherit a generation of people from the American dream and then act all surprised when they don't want to participate anymore. And if you really want to have an impact on the criminal justice system across the board, I think it really does have to start with expecting greatness from our cops treating our cops with the respect they deserve, but understanding that risk assessments and all those things are great ideas, but we really need to ensure that our citizens are being policed in an excellent way.
So with over-criminalization, over-punishment, the front door, the back door, we're concerned about admissions, releases, the churn that occurs in jail. Other systems have to come into play if we're going to prevent that.
Absolutely. And I think when you push something on the criminal justice system, something else explodes. And so we have to attack these issues not from the front end, not from the back end, but from all of the points of all the avenues. Because in the end, if we really want to have robust criminal justice reform, we need to have better cops, better prosecutors, and people should expect greatness from their elected and officials.
And I want to come home on that point in terms of the importance of engaging the community and the formerly incarcerated in thinking about those solutions. What's your take on that?
This has to be a bottom-up approach. Yes, you need good ideas at the top, and they need a trickle down, but trickle-down criminal justice reform can only go so far. You need to have a community, a grassroots, if you will, movement that starts with the communities, the police, and your local elected prosecutors. And from that core, I believe, is where you really have the roots to take place for robust and meaningful criminal justice reform.
So I think it's fair to say that the case for a fair, more just, and equitable criminal justice system doesn't divide along partisan or ideological lines, but reflects our shared and common values as Americans who have our stake in our institutions and our systems. So will you all join me in thanking Arthur, and wait, and wishing him a happy birthday.
For a conversation on the approaches toward money bail reform in America, please welcome Judge Truman Morrison, Senior Judge of the District of Columbia Superior Court. Insha Raman, Program Director at the Vera Institute of Justice, and Rob Bonta, Assistant Majority Leader of the California State Assembly. Here to lead the conversation, please welcome back the Atlantic's Ron Brownstein.
Thank you all. There are a lot of jurisdictions that are rethinking their reliance on money bail, but I don't think most people recognize how far DC itself has gone toward road testing an alternative system, and for how long. Judge Morrison, a couple of years ago, you told the Washington Post, there is no evidence you need money to get people back to court. It's irrational, ineffective, unsafe, and profoundly unfair. So what has DC learned in its over 2 decades about what it takes to create a system that does not rely on money bail, and how applicable could that be to other jurisdictions?
We have learned that judges do not need money to be successful, and that you can operate a big criminal justice system and have it be safe and effective and fair without using money at all.
At all.
We have been an example of the ability to do that successfully now for decades. The tragedy is that the rest of the country, judges almost everywhere, their default tool of first recourse is to decide liberty pre-trial based on people's wealth rather than our best estimate of their likelihood to succeed, which almost everybody will succeed.
What is the major alternative DC has used to, is there one principal alternative, or are there just many?
We outlawed basically detaining people with money. We changed one sentence in our bail law in the early 90s that completely transformed us, and it said that judges can use money bonds if they want to. they're legal in DC, but they can't set a money bond that results in pretrial detention. In other words, you can't, everybody has a right to a money bond that you can meet in the District of Columbia. So tonight on 19th Street in our jail, if you walked the forlorn halls with me, you would not see one woman or one man sitting there too poor to get out. There's no other jail in the United States where that can be said.
Senator California has just taken a big leap in a similar direction. Talk a little bit about SB 10, why you felt it necessary to deal with this, and how you expect it to change the system.
Thank you. First, thank you to the Atlantic and to the MacArthur Foundation for hosting this and inviting me here. California, I think, has just shown with the passage of SB 10 that we agree with Judge Morrison and what Washington, D.C. has done. And we literally looked at their experience, their leadership, what they did with respect to eliminating money bail and what they used as a replacement. We felt in California that we had a fundamentally unfair, unsafe, unjust, ineffective, immoral system based on money, where the jailhouse door was literally swinging open and closed based on how much money you have in your pocket, where people were, their liberty, decisions about their liberty were made based on the size of their wallet instead of the size of their risk, and where it was pay to play. If you had the money, even if you were a risk to the community and you were not going to appear to your next hearing, you could buy your way out of jail. And even if you were going to show up for your next hearing and you're not a risk and you didn't have the money, then you wither away and suffer in jail. And poor people were getting punished for being poor. We thought that was absolutely wrong and it needed to be changed. Massive human impacts, people, because they're in jail, losing their jobs, losing their cars, losing their housing, losing their kids. And we wanted to change that. We wanted to end that anguish, that suffering, that pain. And we set about to change it. And over 2 years, we did.
I'm going to return to the debate over SB 10 in a minute. But let me ask you, you have written something I found interesting. You said, there is no magic bullet, quote, unquote, to reforming bail. So does that mean the same approaches don't necessarily work in all jurisdictions or even for all people in the same jurisdiction?
So what I mean by that is eliminating money bail is step one. And what California has done is remarkable because not only is it taking money out of the equation, it's also eliminating a bail bond industry that has preyed on Americans literally for decades now. So that is huge. But that is actually not the only key reform needed to do bail reform right. The second piece is...
If you go too hard in the beginning, I will calibrate, so don't worry too hard.
Oh, I don't know. The second piece that is critically important, I would say actually more important than simply eliminating the role of money, is making sure that fewer people are in jail as well. And one of the challenges, right, when we've seen this in Washington, D.C., that has essentially stopped using money bonds now for almost 30 years, and it's to be seen in California, is can we actually not impose what's called preventive detention, where people just end up being in jail without any option of getting out? Can we not just substitute one sorting mechanism for another? If not cash bail, then we're just imposing preventive detention instead. And that is actually, I think, the real challenge with bail reform, is can we implement this right so that there are fewer people in jail, not simply just people in jail simply who are there because they are too poor. Those are two different elements that are both key.
And that is precisely the debate in California, where you had some of the usual allies, the ACLU in particular at the end, come out against SB 10 because they felt it gave too much discretion to judges in particular in ordering preventative detention. What were you trying to achieve in those provisions? And how do you respond to the concerns that some of your usual allies have raised about what the final product looked like?
Yeah. You know, the replacement system we proposed in SB 10, and which is now the law in California, is based on the fundamental principles that are used in Washington, D.C., and Kentucky, namely a risk assessment tool, a robust set of pretrial services to oversee the safe release of individuals, the presumption of release, where if people can be safely released, they will, and then we have limited judicial discretion. And I think that last component was where some folks got concerned. We put guardrails and limits around judicial discretion, but we did do what Washington, D.C. has done, which says that under certain circumstances, basically if there's no condition pretrial release or a combination of conditions that can reasonably assure the appearance of the individual and the safety of the public, then they could be detained. And that's meant to be limited only in the rarest of circumstances, but it's there. Mm-hmm. And some of the folks in the coalition were not trusting of that judicial discretion, but we think it's limited, and we think it's an important part of an overall risk assessment regime.
So I really agree with her that we can never have bail reform in America unless we eliminate money. Money has no place in anything that calls itself a justice system. But that is only the first step, and I travel the country selling something that I fought as a young lawyer here in Washington, which is preventive detention. And I sell it because if we just eliminate money, everyone goes home pre-trial. I believe almost every single I believe with Chief Justice Rehnquist in the 1980s that release is the norm in America, and almost everybody can safely be trusted to come back and not get in trouble. But there are always going to be, in my view, a few people who present a challenge in terms of their ability to succeed pre-trial that we can't mitigate. We have to struggle to mitigate that challenge, but there are always going to be a few people. For those people, judges have to have a way that's due process, appropriate, lawful, open, and transparent to hold those people, rich or poor. The key is to keep it limited. And we finally, after decades of fighting to get people to realize you've got to get rid of money, we're not yet quite ready to help them when they ask, okay, we're going to change to what? Change to preventive detention, in my view, that is extremely limited. And as we give that power to judges, we have to limit it at its genesis, at its birth. We can't just leave it up to judges. We have to limit their ability to use preventive detention.
And you think it is possible to limit it in that way, that you can draw limits that will be meaningful,
yes,
and set standards that people can kind of look at from the outside and see are being
There are
consistently
scholars
applied.
who are writing about this. The most important one is a guy named Tim Shinaki. And the short answer is yes.
Do you agree?
It can be done. So I was a public defender. That's how I started my legal career. And what we saw in New York City, which is where I practice, is that even though there is a cash bail system there, judges used it rarely, and only when charges were really serious. And that is, in fact, the right way to think about whether it's through a money bail system or through a system that doesn't rely on money bail at all, how do we very narrowly only use detention for cases where there's no safe way to have this person either return to court or to be safe in the community. And New York City, which is a place that has cash bail, actually is doing that at rates comparable to Washington, D.C., which I think is a little known fact. But in New York, when you step right outside of New York City, where it's really about judicial culture, where judges have said, well, we have a good subway system, we have good pretrial services, we're comfortable releasing people even if they haven't shown up to court in a previous case because we think we can get the supports right. When you don't have that culture, when you don't have the resources and the infrastructure, then the default is for judges to set bail to hold people in because they're worried about their appearance at the next court date, or they're worried about what will happen if that person is in the community. But I think it's possible. It's a culture question.
By the way, I think it is possible that your hair is contributing its own commentary to the conversation this afternoon. So we might, we did not, we will need another chair. So let me ask you this, and I want to start with you because, I mean, California is not the only place where there are complicated cross-currents here. We have been in a number of cities where there's a lot of interest in risk assessment tools as an alternative to the existing system. On the other hand, there was a coalition of over 100 civil rights groups that put out a statement arguing that these tools, perpetuate racial inequities already built into the system. How do you balance that? What is your take on the right way forward on using risk assessment tools?
So risk assessment tools, I think, have taken up this big space in the bail reform sort of conversation that I actually think sort of sidesteps the real issue, which is about limiting that detention net that the judge spoke about. Risk assessment tools are actually, they can be used for good, which is to say quickly, efficiently, these are people that we can release. We're sure they'll come back to court, or we're sure they will not pose any, community safety risk while released. There is a valid use for this shortcut, which is essentially what risk assessment instruments are. Where they pose a really big problem and pose legitimate concern from civil rights groups, from people who care about racial disparities, and we know we have a criminal justice system that has racism baked into its very core. Where it causes concern is, are the racist factors in policing, in convictions, in sentencing, does that get baked into the data and the algorithm that's then used to create these risk assessment instruments that's then used to make decisions about detention? So that's where the concern really lies.
How did you deal with that in SB 10, that question? Risk assessment in general, and then the concern that it merely kind of, it incorporates into an algorithm the existing inequities in the system.
Well, the risk assessment tool was always a desired component of bail reform, and the ACLU wanted it. Even folks who later changed their position wanted it. We were also very cognizant of the possibility that bias be carried forward by those risk assessment tools, so we required that they be validated tools. We required studies and feedback loops of information so that we could change and alter and amend our risk assessment tools if they are carrying forward bias. Whenever you rely on a piece of information from a criminal justice system that has bias baked into it, prior convictions, prior arrests, prior failure to appear, it's going to carry some element of that bias forward. So what are the best ways to mitigate it while still relying on data is kind of the issue. But we always agreed on a risk assessment tool, but we always knew that it would need perfection and cognizance of the possibility of bias being carried forward.
Judge?
Quickly, I was saddened by that statement by the 100 organizations because I believe that risk assessment, they recommended nobody use risk assessments, period. Then they cited a bunch of concerns. I agree with all of the concerns that they cited. They're all legitimate concerns we have to pay attention to about how judges use risk tools, what their limits are, what they can do, what they can't do. But to throw out the possibility of using science to try and predict people's success, not with an eye to detaining them, but with an eye, as was stated, to help us in a refined way release more and more people with appropriate supports, or most importantly, with no supports. And you need, whenever you talk about throwing out scientific help for judges in trying to estimate pretrial success of released people, you have to think compared to what? And let's remember what we have in every courthouse in the United States today. If you think we have a race-neutral, transparent, open, wonderful, effective system, we have nothing that approaches that. And so the way judges set bail all over America now is deeply ingrained with all of the problems in the American criminal justice system, all of which gets compounded in the end by using money to determine human liberty before their trial.
Yeah. Where do you think this goes? I mean, certainly many of the groups who signed that are the same ones who are important in the coalition that is electing reform-oriented DAs or the kind of changes that California is pursuing. If they are turning away from risk assessment, how much impact is that going to have on how this unfolds?
So I think that risk assessments are not going to go away. They are being used in literally hundreds of courtrooms across this country, and we're not going to roll that back entirely. But as the judge mentioned, there's literally one very small paragraph in this statement. It's released by the Leadership Conference. The first statement basically says we don't believe risk assessment instruments should be used because of racial bias and all of those things. And then it is 3 pages of principles and guidelines for, if they are used, how to use them carefully. And the judge raises a really important point, is the way the risk assessment instruments are constructed is science, it is scientific, it is a formula, yet the decisions about who is low risk, medium risk, high risk, those are policy decisions. Those are subjective decisions that we can make differently. What to do with somebody who falls into that medium-high category and whether to release them, perhaps with some supports, but to make the decision not to detain. Those are all policy decisions that we need to make, and we need to have the discussions to change how risk assessment instruments are being used.
We talk about how, how complex the cross currents are on this issue. That's the criticism from kind of the reform camp or the left. Judge, you have cited research showing that people who are not detained, who are not in pretrial, are less likely to commit future crimes. So there's a case in terms of public safety for keeping people out of detention. On the other hand, there is always the risk, as we talked about in the last panel, that someone who is diverted will commit another crime, maybe even a serious crime. You're looking down the barrel of an effort to repeal this already from the bail bonds. And how vulnerable is this kind of reform to just simply the one bad example?
That's been a problem in politics for a long time.
Yeah.
Starting with, we all know about the Willie Horton issue, and that fear that lingers in the minds of elected officials, judges. But I think we've moved past that in California.
Mm-hmm.
We passed Prop 47, we passed Prop 57, we passed Prop 64, major criminal justice reforms, and in this year SB 10. The tough on crime time is in our rearview mirror, and it was proven to be wrong in the view of Californians, and we need to do it a better way, a different way. So I think that lingers for some. I think the referendum effort by the bail industry is expected. If they get the signatures, they actually put a stay on implementation of SB 10.
I was astounded to read that, actually. As a California resident, once they get the signatures, the law is in abeyance until the actual, so that could be 2 years.
Exactly, and could be a strategy in and of itself, to buy another year of time to continue to operate, which is exactly what the plastic bag manufacturers did when we implemented our plastic bag ban. They qualified a referendum, they got another year of making their plastic bags, and then the Californians summarily rejected their effort.
Could I just add that it's really important to note that the scholars disagree about risk assessments and a lot of things, and a lot of thinkers disagree about the right, best way forward. There is only one group in the United States of America who advocates with a straight face that we ought to use money to decide liberty, and it is the people who we have enabled down at the justice marketplace. We have allowed bondsmen to charge a 10% fee and line their pockets with from desperate families trying to get people out. Nobody is making the case for keeping money in America as part of our justice system, except the bail bondsmen who profit from it. If I could just add this business about risk assessment, I just want to give a really quick plug because it's such a complicated topic. There's an article coming out in the Yale Law Review very soon, written by a brilliant young scholar named Sandra Mason at the University of Georgia, which, if anybody can get it up to read a law review article, this, which is coming out very soon, will explain all of the policy things, all the science things, discusses all the issues we've been talking about risk assessment, and importantly, she does not call for throwing them all in the trash. So, sorry.
All right, I was just thinking that it's good to be reminded that there's something going on at Yale Law School beside drinking parties. Beside keg parties.
As an alum, that hurts.
Right? Yeah, just in case you were wondering. Let's go to the audience in the back, since we didn't do that before.
As someone who's new to this topic and not familiar with risk assessments, can you give us an example of low risk, medium risk, and high risk?
Sure.
And the other question,
you have your next panel.
And the other question is, does mental health or drug use, which from what we heard accounts for a substantial number of people that get into the criminal justice system, do they somehow appear within how we measure risk and what we do about it?
We're going to hear more on that in the next panel, but if you want to give maybe a quick answer about how the instruments work?
Sure. I don't want to get too into it, but certainly different risk assessment tools have different factors, and some ask questions about substance use, about prior mental health, medications, things like that, and can be factored into whether somebody is low, medium, or high risk. Others do not look at those factors. The other thing is that there's a huge range across the country of how good these risk assessment tools are. All of them are certainly not built the same.
Do we have another question? Down here? Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. A very, very interesting conversation. And I believe in everything you're talking about. But I'm also aware that the murder rates in Chicago and Washington, D.C., the numbers of shootings are going up. And it does happen in communities of color, not only. But there is a challenge there. Can we talk about that?
Balancing reform and safety. I mean, that clearly is an issue.
I'll talk to New York City. So New York City is the safest big city in America. We have the lowest crime rate that we've had in 55 years. Last year we had 341 murders, which for a city of 8.67 million is remarkably low. And what we've also done in New York City is we've dropped our jail population from a high of 20,000 back in 1992 to around 8,000 people in jail on any given day today. So what New York City shows you, New York City, is that you can actually get more public safety by having fewer people in jail. Incarceration does not actually deliver public safety. Certain communities are certainly more hard hit and feel the impact of violence and crime far more than others. That's not at all to gloss over that fact. But the fact that New York City has used incarceration and jail less, to the point that was made earlier that even just 2 days in jail, 3 days in jail can actually lead to what's known in the business as a criminogenic effect, meaning somebody is more likely to have continued contact with the criminal justice system, to get rearrested, to offend again. If you keep people out of jail in the first place, it means that they get a fighting chance to stay with their families, to be in their jobs, to be in their communities, and we know that that's what keeps people and communities safe.
And money bond never keeps us safe.
Yeah.
If I had a chance to explain to you how it works, it would shock you. Yeah. But it has nothing to do with safety.
What do you believe the impact of SB 10 will be on crime rates and safety? What was the research that you were able to look at?
We think that there will be a very positive human impact for those who, as I mentioned, lost their jobs, kids, homes, cars. We think that people who can be safely released are not, and that when they're incarcerated, you're more likely to, pre-trial, you're more likely to take a plea and have a conviction on your record, which hurts your ability to get housing and jobs and student loans. And
thus increases the risk that you will offend again?
Yes, by learning to be a criminal potentially. Yeah. And so we think it's better to be in your community with your family, working at your job, if that can be safely done. So we think this is going to keep crime rates low.
That was a great conversation. Join me in thanking the panel. Thank you all. Really fun. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
To discuss the role of data and technology in justice, please welcome to the stage Vincent Sutherland, Executive Director of the NYU Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and Logan Kepke, Senior Policy Analyst at Upturn. Joining them on stage is Adrian Green, The Atlantic's Managing Editor.
Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
As we've heard a bunch today, the role of data in the criminal justice system has evolved a lot in the last decade. People tend to trust data-driven systems. They remove supposedly some of the human errors that have, laid waste to the best parts of the criminal justice system. How are you seeing folks balance the desire to combat, this injustice in the system with the growing skepticism of big data as it's applied to criminal justice?
So, I think, fundamentally, one of the problems with this kind of drive towards data-driven and kind of algorithmic decision-making is the concern that the data that people are relying on is infected with this country's history of racism and inequality. And essentially what you're doing is replicating that terrible history by using data that is essentially garbage and kind of putting it through a machine and getting garbage out and getting garbage predictions. And so I think that's the kind of fundamental problem. And I think people are becoming more and more aware of that problem as there's been more of an effort to rely on these types of tools to try and help and improve criminal justice decision making. I think that part of it, kind of the acknowledgement and understanding, is a really good thing and a positive development. But I remain kind of incredibly skeptical about the usefulness of using these approaches.
Logan, what are some of the misconceptions as you're looking at, data being heralded as one of these really positive things for the criminal justice system? What are some misconceptions about the way that it's actually applied?
So I think one helpful thing is, I think frequently we think that data is objective and it represents the sort of like natural existence of something occurring in the world. But of course, when we're talking about the criminal justice system, criminologists have long studied this and said that really this underlying data is representative of enforcement patterns. It's not necessarily representative of quote-unquote underlying crime data and the actual commission of crime. And we have to remember that this is representative of how police officers are responding to things in their community. And I think that's a fundamental disconnect, because I frequently am talking with different individuals who are saying, hey, if I want to adopt something like a pretrial risk assessment tool or a predictive policing system, this is just sort of objective data that's arrest level data. But of course, we know that different things are arrested at different patterns for different groups. For example, we know that domestic violence is often not reported. And so if you're going to build a model that was going to forecast where domestic violence crimes might be committed or forecast, you'd have statistically unreliable data simply because that's not reported. And you can go into various different reasons why that might not be reported, for fear of the police, fear of reporting, many different things. But I think there's just this myth that this crime data is inherently objective in some way.
Can that be overcome?
I think it can be.
Big question.
I don't know if it can necessarily be overcome, because in some sense, all police departments will inherently be constrained, right? There are going to be some number of units of officers who can only respond to some number of things, right? I think one thing to think about is potentially there are maybe some crimes that don't show sort of underlying disparities in arrest level data that communities maybe truly are shown to truly care about, where they're struggling with maybe saying domestic violence or aggravated assault, things like that. But I don't think I see many strategies that are improving that today.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it can be overcome. I don't think that it can, actually. I think we can confront it. I think we may be able to account for it. I'm not a kind of a data scientist or a technologist in that way, but I think there may be ways to try and account for some measure of where kind of the racism or the bias is kind of influencing the data. But I think fundamentally, there's so much inequality and so much racial bias woven into the DNA of this country that kind of whatever system you tie it back to, there's going to have some racial impact. Right? And so kind of whether you're looking at housing, education, employment, age at first arrest, where police are deployed, all those things are tied into race. And so I think in order to kind of scrub the data, so to speak, of the racism, I think is an incredibly difficult, if not impossible task, at least from my view.
So how do we account for it?
Well, my thing is we just stop using these tools. We kind of go in a different direction. And fundamentally right now, all the tools are being pointed at the people who are being consumed by these systems. I would like to see tools that are aimed at police officers, judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, to determine, if we have a concern about trying to change the system itself and the behavior of actors within the system, why don't we try to change the behaviors of those who are kind of replicating some of the biases we see already? Why are we trying to predict what people might do? The reality is, as a public defender, there are some people who I knew would come back to court. Some people I thought would definitely come back to court without any problems. Some people I thought would never show up again. And I was surprised regularly about what would happen. The human condition is really difficult to predict. And I think the idea that we'll be able to predict it better with machines fundamentally misunderstands how people work.
I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, on that point, I think something that's been interesting is sort of when we think about sort of big data or algorithms, a lot of this is focused on prediction generally, and of course there's sort of prediction is ubiquitous throughout the criminal justice system, and individuals will be predicting things on their own. But I think hopefully many people did not need this reminder, but as new tools have been developed, you have sort of rote, more actuarial based regression statistics tools, and then you have more sort of machine learning based tools. I think as you sort of try and refine this along the path, what you're really doing, there's a great new paper by Sandy Mason that'll be published in the Yale Law Journal that basically says what we're doing is really just sort of putting up a mirror that is just more and more accurate, and the solution isn't to bend the mirror to your liking, so it's not to account for like, okay, how can we adjust the model? Like, what matters is what you're seeing in the mirror, right? And that is the underlying thing that you should really be trying to adjust for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of gets to the fundamental point that what we need to do is have kind of a paradigm shift about the way we do criminal justice, not kind of like tinkering around the edges and making a bad system work a little bit more efficiently. I think that's what these tools often purport to do.
Yeah, it sounds like both of you have brought up that basically these technologies are just kind of preserving the same system under the guise of scientific objectivity. Talk about how that perceived objectivity is kind of stifles progress.
Well, I mean, I think in many ways there's this sense that if you're kind of relying on a tool and a tool tells you that this individual may or may not do this particular thing, you're never going to kind of do any kind of deeper inquiry into what the kind of the human condition is about. And so you're never going to find out. Like, so for example, I think when you think about a risk assessment tool that's designed to figure out if someone's going to kind of appear in court or not, the type of data they're usually looking at are kind of age of first arrest, prior warrant history, the things that they may think correlate with failure to appear. But there are other data points that are never kind of examined. You may not return to court because you just don't have the resources to get back to court. You may not return to court because you have a terrible experience with court before and you're worried about what's going to happen. You may not return to court because you have family circumstances or other things that may have interfered with your ability to get back to court. A data point that's not kind of considered at all is never going to be measured and never going to be part of kind of your range of considerations. So I think that's problematic in and of itself.
Yeah, Logan, we were talking a little bit backstage about kind of the slow-moving policy reform, how quickly and rapidly technology changes, and how the dissonance between those timelines makes it really difficult for policy to catch up. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think one sort of interesting paradox is sort of, if you look at sort of the current movement of bail reform as it's conceptualized with certain policymakers, I think there's a sort of unanimous understanding that the money bail system needs to go away. And a lot of policymakers are looking towards risk assessment tools to sort of reform away an unjust system. And along the way, they're adopting good policies. So money bail, that means, if you are a person who can't pay $500 to get out of jail, there are plenty of studies that show that your risk of rearrest will be increased because in the 72 hours you've been detained, your life might have fallen apart. You could lose your job, lose custody of your children, things like that. There are other important policies like text reminders can reduce failure to appear a lot. But the problem is when we implement these new technologies, they're inherently looking to the past. So if you're looking to something that doesn't incorporate the actual new beneficial policies, you're just going to be forecasting the likelihood of someone's risk based on the previous system. So it's really hard to generate these positive feedback loops because frequently these counties and cities don't have the budget to do quote-unquote data science properly. And it's a really hard task to get right. And I think that's an underappreciated element in the current debate.
So how do we, cast our lenses forward? What are the challenges in trying to do something that's forward-looking instead of something that uses kind of historical data that doesn't work?
So one thing that's interesting is there's a great paper that's sort of trying to reframe this entire debate. It's called Interventions Over Predictions. And really what it's postulating is instead of looking at this sort of risk assessment stuff that's trying to look at historical data to project things forward, it's saying, let's look at something called causal inference methods. So that's basically trying to do new statistical techniques where you're trying to say what interventions really actually work. So by doing that, you're creating new data that can actually say, okay, this actual new change helps someone get back to the court. This new change helped this class of defendants never get touched by the criminal justice system again. And I think that's one thing that's sort of more forward-looking.
Yeah, and to me that sounds a little bit kind of like more of a needs assessment intervention than anything else. And so when you think about predictive policing and the notion that it's going to predict where where a crime might take place or who might be involved in crime. Rather than send, if you think a neighborhood is going to be the site of some criminal activity, why are we sending police officers into that neighborhood? Why don't we figure out, like, okay, that neighborhood needs more schools, that neighborhood needs more jobs, that neighborhood needs more social workers. You know, to me, I'm always struck by the fact that our response to some of these inequities is a criminal justice response, rather than a kind of a social justice response, rather than a response that actually lifts up people and helps them avoid the path of criminality. And so you know, part of what I would like to see is that type of methodology instilled as well.
Absolutely. Before I take it to the audience for a question, I wanted to ask one bigger, broader question. We talked about pretrial risk tools and predictive policing, and we're often using these big terms like risk and danger, and they're often ill-defined and subjectively applied. How does that complicate the use of data? Obviously, it sounds like you both think that neither of those tools are a step in the right direction, but how does one even begin to calculate a tolerable amount of risk in a community or a tolerable amount of danger?
I would just note that when we think about bail, it wasn't legal necessarily for judges to predict future dangerousness until about 1987 when the Supreme Court codified it. So this is a new sort of legal regime that we've established. So there's nothing necessarily, I mean, we can have a spirited debate about the underlying sort of court's decisions leading to the predictions of future dangerousness. But I just sort of question how, I mean, from one perspective, we have sort of rearrest data standing in for the proposition of sort of public safety. But so many things that people are rearrested for say nothing about violence to a community or public safety at all. And I just color me skeptical that any risk assessment tools as sort of currently proposed and implemented will sort of succeed in their aims.
And you know, I'll just say very quickly, I think fundamentally risk is part of life. You know, I think you can't, we could walk outside and get hit by a bus, you know, but you don't stop crossing the street because of that. Like that's part, like risk is what the criminal justice system has to accept as part of the cost of doing business. And so I think no one will be able to predict who's riskier, who's not. To me, it just doesn't kind of really make any sense.
Do we have a question in the audience? I think we have one down here in the front.
Hi, it's me again, Vivian Nixon. So I want to ask, what roles do you think using science that actually would help, like science about sentencing reform and decriminalization, could do to eliminate some of the problems we're facing?
So I mean, I think there is, like, to the extent you're looking at data and thinking about science, I think to the extent you're holding up kind of good results from things like decriminalization, from things like de-incarcerating places, from things like releasing people early from sentences, from diverting people from the criminal justice system, I think that data, for some reason, is never kind of the stuff that people cite or think about when thinking about kind of evidence-based practices, right? And so I think those are all data points that would be very helpful in informing kind of decision-making about the way in which we should kind of shape our criminal justice policy more generally. So I'm all for using data in that way. I think, to me, it's just problematic when you're deciding how long you're going to sentence somebody for, or if you're going to release them on parole. Even in the bail context, I mean, I think there's a place to say, here's an entire class of people, and by the way, the vast majority of people who are released from pretrial incarceration return to court. So it's not as though we have people kind of just skipping court willy-nilly all the time. But here's an entire population of folks, or a cohort of folks, who can be released without ever even going through the court system at all. And so I think there are probably ways you can use it in a positive way. But unfortunately, those don't seem to be the ones that are kind of advanced that often.
So we have one more question in the back.
Hi, how y'all doing? So really quickly, thank you, number one. I just read this book by James Foreman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own, which was amazing if you guys haven't read it. But he really just talks about how these innate community barriers that should be more of a human services issue have been criminalized. So when you deal with things like addiction, we've turned addiction into a criminalization. So when you have someone who commits crimes as a result of their addiction, we want to lock them up and instead of sending them back to rehab. And his whole statement was, why don't we view why don't we view rehab the same way that we view the prison system? Like the first time you try to quit smoking, you're probably not going to get it. So why don't we send them back there as opposed to putting them into prison because they didn't kick the habit the first time? So my question is, in what way, if possible, do you think that we can start to, it could possibly incorporate these community conditions and these restorative types of practices so that everyone who suffers from, everyone who's not just a hardened criminal isn't caught up in that whirlpool, if you will?
I think one interesting idea to kind of combine both questions is, I think you could reconceptualize risk assessments to include another factor. So, for example, the risk of any pretrial detention greater than 24 hours to that person. What impact would that have on their life? We know of all these sort of negative outcomes. Actually sort of formalizing that for the process could really, I think, recalibrate and get us closer to that model of course, when we're thinking of addiction, your first time trying to struggle through that, it's not necessarily going to sort of latch your first time. You have to try and try and try. I think sort of maybe potentially having this sort of, if we were to put this person inside the system, how would that impact them in a negative way? I think that might be one potential solution. Yeah.
Vincent, Logan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joining Adrian Green to discuss the impact of prison education initiatives, please welcome Lynn Novick, director and producer of College Behind Bars, and Jewel Hall, alumnus of the Bard Prison Initiative.
Lynn, Jewel, welcome.
Thank you.
So, when we talk about reentry, one of the we talk a lot about the social and the psychological and the financial challenges to reentry, and recidivism is a thing that preoccupies a lot of that attention. There's a mounting level of evidence that says that college education programs in prisons drastically reduces recidivism. And one of the programs that has most been highly acclaimed is the Bard Prison Initiative. The incarcerated students there have a 4% rate of recidivism instead of a general 60% for the general population. Lynn, that program is actually the basis of a new documentary for you, and Jules, you actually were a participant in the program. Lynn, I wanted to direct the first question at you. What drew you to this particular program?
Well, I had the wonderful opportunity. My colleague and partner, producer Sarah Botstein, and I had the chance to teach one class in the program in 2012. We were asked to guest teach a class. We went up to a maximum security prison in upstate New York and went into the classroom with the students in the program and had a conversation about our film about prohibition. And we had an extraordinarily interesting and profound and sophisticated conversation with those students. And as we walked out, we said, this is really remarkable and not many people know about what's happening here. Someone should make a film about it. It took quite a while. I had the chance to teach in the program for half a semester the next year, and we were able to convince the Department of Corrections in New York and Max Kenner, who started the program and runs it, to let us have access over 4 years to film the students currently and formerly incarcerated as they made their way through the program to get degrees. We were interested in 2 basic questions: what is prison for, and who in America has access to education? So it's been really a 6-year project for us.
Well, before we get into the details about the documentary, why don't we let the folks in the audience try to see a clip?
And it's a 4-part series. We're going to show you the very beginning of part 2.
Jewel, you were a participant in the program. Talk to me a little bit about your experience and why you decided to enroll.
Well, it was the hardest thing I ever done. I decided to enroll because I knew what was at stake in my life, and I felt that prison wasn't providing me with the ways to engage myself and to transform myself and develop into a new individual. I wanted to be new. I wanted to transform, but prison didn't provide me with those tools. So when I heard of Barred Prison Initiative, I went all out to get to the facility, because mind you, it's not in every facility, unfortunately. So I really went to my guidance counselor and told her, I need a transfer, I need to go to Barred.
One of the gentlemen in the video said that it was the hardest thing that he'd ever done. Describe to me, what were the classes like? What did you love about it? What was challenging to you?
So the challenge was being able to engage this really dense material. We dealt with Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and by the first 2 weeks of the class, you have that headache like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm reading. But when you get to, the 9th week or the 10th week, you're an expert in Friedrich Nietzsche. So I think one of the things that enlivened me was to be able to sit in a classroom with my peers and exchange ideas without any type of prejudice or any type of judgment, that we all knew we were here to engage this literary material and to explore various ideas without reproach or contradiction, but a lot of debate.
I think the thing that stuck the most with me from seeing the video and listening to your stories is it's not just that you're learning, advanced mathematics or dealing with deep textual literature. It's the man in the video that said he felt cheated out of his early education. It's the other guy that said that, they taught him how smart he already was. Not how to be smart, but how to engage with his own intelligence. And it felt a lot like being free of people's low expectations of you. Is that something that registered with you while you were there?
Yes. What my story is, when I was in high school, I used to read the first chapter of a book, the middle chapter of a book, and the end chapter of the book, and I would be able to get through the class without any problem. But once I got to Bard, I had to read. I had to read with a dictionary next to me so that I could understand what I was reading. And to be able to engage on that level has made me the person I am today, to whereas I feel like there are so many subjects, diverse interests, but I can engage them all.
Lynn, you've worked on a bunch of different documentaries. We actually screened your collaboration with Ken Burns at this festival last year on Vietnam. What made this feel different? What did you take away from these men and these people that you experienced?
Wow. Well, I should also say that we did focus as well on a group of women who were in the program, and so there's a major through line of group of incarcerated women, but the clip we showed was for men. For Sarah Botstein and myself and our producer Mariah Duran and our entire team, it was such a privilege to try to tell this story, or to find a way to bring cameras into these facilities and get to know these extraordinary people and understand what their lives were like and what the struggles they were going through in this incredibly rigorous program. We learned something every day, and we just wanted to make the best film we could to honor the gift they gave us of letting us sort of eavesdrop on their world and try to shine a light on this extraordinarily complicated situation, which is that most people incarcerated don't have access to programs like this. So what's at stake? One of the things we filmed was orientation, where Max Kenner, the director of the program, orients the new students, and he sort of says, something is at stake now for you that wasn't at stake before. You have a lot to lose. We all have a lot to lose if we don't make this a success for yourself and for everybody who's in it. So we feel the same way. There's a lot at stake with our film, that we really want to get it right, just out of gratitude.
One of the big questions that you offered in talking about why you were drawn to this program is, what is prison for? You talked a little bit just now about access to education and the fact that it's obviously not equal, but did you get the answer to your own question?
Well, I think probably we don't have enough time to really delve deeply into it, but punishment, we hope our film raises those questions for audiences to really think about, and I think I'd rather defer to Jewel to some degree, but the idea that prison is solely a vehicle for punishment, whether there should even be prison, and what is it accomplishing, these are deep, deep questions. But I think the film is also saying, meanwhile, we have prisons. Whether we think we should or not, what's happening inside them, and what could be happening, so that while we figure out whether we should have prisons or not, or what we're doing, we make sure that the time that people have to spend there is not.
And if I may, I just want to acknowledge that there are so many people who are in New York State prisons just like me, looking for the opportunity to reconcile with their wrongs, looking for the opportunity to transform their lives. But there aren't many programs that allows us to do that. And it becomes a bit of a despairing situation, because you realize, like, here I am in prison and want to change, and I can't. I'm being reinforced to do wrong by the culture that's here without any avenue to take a more constructive approach to my self-development. So it's not, I'm not the only individual who I witnessed into this program and felt, oh, wow, this is just what I was looking for.
How did it change your experience post-release?
It's amazing that the skills and the attitudes I learned at Bard are so useful to me now in the professional world. Being able to take on the challenge of having this hard text that I have to devote 3 hours without looking at TV to read is the same type of attitude and drive that I bring to, my work in the professional realm.
Before we take it to audience questions, I wanted to ask you both one last question. We talked a lot today about how people interact with the carceral system. What are some misconceptions that you, have witnessed, and how are you kind of working your way through them? You just talked about not being the only one that wants to achieve these kind of programs. Lynn, I'm interested to bring you in and see if there are things that you saw that you were shocked by.
I was shocked and stunned every day, and just being inside maximum security prison. I wasn't there every day, but we spent many, many, many days in and out. There's, people talk a lot about alienation. So, if you're ignorant, which I admit I was, I've never having been inside prisons before we got involved with the project, you think you're going to be maybe walking to a place where there's a lot of violence and kind of chaos. But I think what you sense is the loneliness and alienation to some degree of just people being isolated from their families, from the world. And there's something very, very heavy about spending time there. You can't really describe it except just actually be able to go and see that. But I could go on and on. I just think one of the things the film can do is bring people who haven't had the chance to go, which I'm sad to say is probably most people. If you don't have a relative or family member or someone you know, for most Americans, they can just think that's happening somewhere else. It doesn't involve me. It doesn't affect me. Not my problem. And I think we all have an obligation to try to educate ourselves about what's actually going on inside these facilities.
I did some time in there, so I have a lot of stories.
Yeah.
But I would say that one of the things that really stuck with me is seeing people go home and come right back. And I was in a position of saying, if I only had that chance once, I would never come back. But then when I sat and talked with the brothers, of course, because I was in an all-male facility, I'm pretty sure it would be the same in a women's facility, the brothers conveyed the idea that they weren't prepared to go home. And that was just like so shocking to me, that not only was I in prison looking for a way to transform myself, but here you have people being released and coming back saying, I wasn't ready. So that's just really shocking to me, and I think that is something that also lends credit to the need for a more rehabilitative and a less punitive approach to our carceral system.
I want to take a question from the audience right here. To my
Thank you guys very much, and Joel, thank you for telling your story, and I hope that you are an inspiration to many other people, both who have been in prison and who hopefully never will go to prison. I'm just wondering when and how we can see the film.
Oh, to see the film? Yeah. Yes, it will be on PBS in 2019. We're not exactly sure when. We're going to find that out soon, and we're hoping to have a very robust outreach and engagement campaign to bring it around the country, both before the broadcast and after, and to organize screenings with alums and interested parties, stakeholders, as they say, and to also, make it available as widely as possible.
Awesome. We have one more question in the back.
What do you think it would take to extend this program universally in prisons? What are the challenges of doing that?
I would say it's not really a big challenge. It's really easy. It's relatively easy. I mean, you know, I don't want to speak loosely because anything that's worth something is hard, but it just takes, you know, the will. And unfortunately, we don't have the will to spread these programs. It's not about finances. It's not about the correctional environment itself, because people are hungry for these programs. But we have to have the will. We have to understand that this is helpful for society and our democracy. So until we get there, I mean, we live in a partisan time, but once we get there, I don't think it'll be too much of a challenge.
And I mean, we do feel we haven't shown the film much. Honestly, this is really the first public screening where anyone outside of our little world of just people helping us make the film have seen it. But the reaction, just, you know, when people see this film and see what's possible and how it's not so hard to, there's a hunger for it, there's an interest in it. It is a question of sort of priorities and addressing the central question what prison is for as well.
And it works.
And it's so effective, right?
It works. People, you know, people from BPI are home now in hospitals doing constructive work, doing social justice work, are doing constructive, positive things in society. And it's not just BPI, I would say. It's also people who have received college educations inside of a correctional environment. They are released and they become more civic beings, as one person said. Yeah. In the film.
And I mean, one of the things we talk about in the film is the politics that in 1994, as part of the Clinton crime bill, Pell Grants were taken away from anyone who was incarcerated. So there had been college programs in almost every state and every prison, and almost overnight just vanished. And so there is some movement towards bringing that money, you know. It's available. Thank you. There is a bill. Thank you, Vivian. Yeah. As I was about to try to explain, right, there is a bill to get Pell Grants back, and that's a huge step. That would be a huge step. And on state, there's lots of things happening on many state levels as well.
Jewel, Lynn, thank you guys so much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
To discuss the power of art to make lasting change, please welcome to the stage Brandon B. Mike Odoms, visual artist at Studio B in New Orleans. Joining him is Matt Thompson, executive editor of The Atlantic.
Mike, we were talking backstage, having been talking for the past few minutes, we were talking backstage about how does this conversation fit into the day's event. We've got this nice crowd, ladies and gentlemen gathered to hear about prosecutorial discretion and bail reform and algorithmic justice and all the things, and we're going to talk about graffiti for a moment. But this conversation is, I think, very relevant, and particularly so given the particular nature of the work that you do. You are a graffiti artist, and your work, therefore, exists, that form, your art form, exists in many places in a gray area of the law. And that can have consequences. Let's start with Project B. So you've had this tremendous arc, this tremendous career. You began with Project B, taking an abandoned, just looking at the possibility, bringing out the possibility in an abandoned project in New Orleans. And most recently, your now 35,000 square foot studio, Studio B, has been featured on Queen Sugar, Ava DuVernay's show. You have thrown a party with thousands of people featuring the likes of Erykah Badu on stage. Tell us about Project B.
Yeah.
Let's start there.
I mean, I think art is a form of communication, and New Orleans was faced with a very big crisis. You know, Hurricane Katrina did a lot of things that was one part nature, one part political, and space became a huge political conversation. So spaces that were forgotten in the context of a city moving forward, I found that walls became the best way to have a conversation around those forgotten spaces. And I wasn't the first to do it, but there were other artists and people who were using walls to communicate, and I felt, I wanted to add my voice to that song, if you will. And that particular space, I started painting in, not knowing people would pay attention nationally or even outside of the neighborhood that I painted in, but it started something that ended up consuming my life.
Yeah. So it's just, this was an abandoned housing complex. And you didn't like ask anyone's permission. You just...
No, you don't ask permission. I mean, it was one of those things where we felt, myself as well as the other artists I met in the process, we felt if anybody was super concerned about what we were doing, their priorities were mixed up, because here was a space, like I said, it was 8 years post-Katrina, completely abandoned and forgotten, to those who saw it from a distance. But to the people who live next door, the people who walk by it every day, it was a constant reminder of neglect. And if anything, if that space was sick, we felt art had a responsibility of sorts to heal it, or art had a role to play in changing the narrative, or at least amplifying the voices of those who were nearby.
Yeah. And there was a moment, because of the property manager at that complex, he came by and he saw you, and he saw the work that you were doing. And what happened next?
There was a crossroads where it could have went a few ways. It could have been, I see what you're doing, I'm fearful and I'm calling the authorities, or I'm curious about what you're doing. And we saw the curiosity, so we saw the curiosity as an opportunity. One of my favorite quotes says, when you see boundaries as opportunities, the world becomes a limitless place. And so that boundary became an opportunity, and out of that opportunity grew what became known as Exhibit B, which was we asked for permission to take a part of that space and to invite artists to come in and transform this neighborhood or this unit of apartments. And it was over 35 artists. It took us about 15 days, and we transformed it and invited the public, and it just kind of... That could have went a lot of ways, too.
Also could have went a lot of ways, yeah. I think that that's a really powerful place to begin this conversation in light of what you all have been, what we've been talking about here on stage all day. That crossroads of possibility, one direction going into a place that I don't think any of us want, and one direction going into this place of just transcendent beauty. Let's take that moment to actually look at some of the work that you've done to see this art. So I don't know if you can see this image, B-Mike. Talk about this, where this is in New Orleans.
So this is on the backside of Studio B, my warehouse in New Orleans, 35,000 square feet. It's like the end of the story, I guess, if you will, in terms of after painting in public spaces in New Orleans for a series of years, finding myself in this interior space where I was given access to just make it my first solo show. So in this 35,000 square foot warehouse is all my artwork. And on the outside of this building is this, there's a few paintings, but this is the newest one I just completed a couple weeks ago. And it's just a dedication to the creative spirit of New Orleans, but also the possibility of that neighborhood, the possibility of, I like to think that in my art, I hope people could see themselves reflected. And in this idea of growth, there's a quote on the wall by Clint Smith, a friend of mine who's a poet, and it says, "Your joy has inscribed itself on the sidewalk and has never been washed away." So these are opportunities to articulate and to just have a love story. It's like a poem, every painting I can do, and that's what that embodies.
You said that one of your mentors had been talking to you about truth, integrity. You said to Ebony Magazine, you said, "My elders taught me art for art's sake is not true. Artists will always, as Paul Robeson said, be the gatekeepers of truth." Yeah. And that conversation happened in the context of the use of halos. One of the things that you have been working around in your art has been the use of halos and images like this. Talk about your evolution on how you've used halos around figures of the civil rights movement.
I mean, I think it's fitting that we're in the portrait gallery, and it's a conversation around what portraits are allowed to do. I think portraits traditionally have been reserved in a lot of ways for those who society deemed important enough to be painted. And I think a lot of work that I do around portraits, especially being blessed to do portraits on large scales that interrupt people's visual pathway. You know, people don't ask to see this, or for the most part, if they drive in the street, they're going to see this. And I think there's an opportunity there to assign value to narratives that can be overlooked. And so being that I paint portraits oftentimes of people of color, oftentimes of children, it's an opportunity to say that there's value here. And I think for me in the beginning, doing halos was a way to, it was like a crutch of sorts to say, okay, I'm going to force you to see the value by seeing this halo that we traditionally reserved for deities or for things that are religious-based. So the halo was kind of like a way to instantly confirm or solidify that this person is valuable. I think, though, however, that I kind of been transitioning out of the use of halos in a way to show that just the sake of being human is enough to show value, that we exist and we breathe, and that's enough to make that kid valuable. Yeah. And so, but I think that's what paintings is at its best can do. The idea of art for art's sake, I think, is a privilege, you know, to say that I can just create from what's in my head, and that alone is what I will do. I think what Paul Robeson, at least the way I interpret it, his idea of artists being the gatekeepers of truth, there's a responsibility there that says, okay, if you're on this stage, if you have this platform, there's a responsibility that truth has to be spoken. And I think it was Dr. Cornel West that said a condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. He said you can't speak truth unless somehow in your words embodies the pains and bruises of everyday people. And so for me, that's the responsibility of an artist, to say, okay, with my paintbrush, with my can, I'm going to speak truth. That's what we did in that abandoned space. We didn't just say, okay, let's paint rainbows and pretty things. Yeah. We had to be truthful. We had to say, okay, what exists here is a story that people overlooked, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about displacement. Let's talk about how people who were forced out of New Orleans couldn't return. Let's talk about the conditions that created a space like this. And I think that's why people resonated with the work so well.
Yeah. I'm going to move to the next image. Where is this in the city, and why the Sistine Chapel?
So this is in New Orleans East, and there's an area of New Orleans. We were having conversations around peace and around violence reduction. And the goal was to, at that time, New Orleans East was one of the most violent areas of the city. And I worked with some community members and community organizations that were working towards curbing the violence. And here was the opportunity to amplify a message about peace, but also to encourage those who were doing the work. So all in these paintings are individuals who are doing the work in that neighborhood. And it was a gift to them in a way, to show them that, you know, their work is appreciated, their efforts are not overlooked. But then there's a reminder in the corner, and it says, we have work to do. And this it's an abandoned movie theater in New Orleans, and it sits off of an interstate, one of the main interstates in the city. So everyone has to see this. And so it's a reminder that there's work to be done, but it's also a celebration of those doing the work. And the Sistine Chapel aspect of it is just a way, at the time, there was criticisms around my use of spray paint and how that isn't art. And this somebody, I think the comment, you always think about the negative comments, but somebody
don't read the comments.
Somebody posted, oh, this is just glorified graffiti. And so here was a way to show, okay, you know, Sistine Chapel was not on canvas. That was like street art or a mural, or, you know, so it was a way to kind of reconnect it back to what people might consider to be art. So yeah.
We're going to show one last image, and this is also a reference to a series of iconic images that touch on activism. The flower and the bayonet. This evokes a lot of images going back to the Vietnam War and probably before. And most recently, there was that image of Aisha Evans facing down in nothing more than a dress, a set of cops in body armor. Talk about this image and what led you to create it.
Inside Studio B, and it's one of the walls that existed. I built some walls in the space, but this wall existed when I got there. And it was an attempt to have this updated conversation around policing, as well as around the superpower that I find that these giants in history that I celebrate, that they all had. And next to this wall is a portrait of Dr. King, there's a portrait of Coretta, Fannie Lou Hamer, Paul Robeson. And when we do tours here with kids, we tell them, you know, when do you give people flowers? And they all say, oh, when you love somebody, when you like somebody. All in the gun it says fear, and all in her hair it says love. This was inspired by two quotes, one by the poet Saul Williams, and he said, I'm not afraid of you, I'm just a victim of your fear. And when you think about that, you kind of get an understanding of policing. You'll see some of the things that we've seen around policing. And then there's another quote that was inspired by the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he said, how do you look terror in the face and still muster the courage to love? And to me, that's the superpower. Like, how do you look at terror and say, you know what, my response to this will be love? And I always tell the kids, you know, that's what, at its best, is depicted through the histories that we celebrate. This history of love that says, you know what, if you don't like me, I'm not going to respond by not liking you more.
Yeah.
But somehow I'm going to find the courage to love. And that's what that piece is about.
Your work exists in, your art form exists in this continuum.
Mm-hmm.
On one end, you've got, you said, you know, art for art's sake is not true. On one end of graffiti art, you've got taggers. And these are folks who are just spraying their tag on every surface that they can reach in a city, just to say, I'm here, I exist, and I reach this place, right? And then on the other end, you've got this. You've got these murals, these incredible, these gigantic works of creation. I'm curious, talking about art being true. Part of what you did with Project B, part of what you do at Studio B, is you try to not only imagine, take the beauty that exists in a space and expose it to the public, but you're also showing something that's possible. What is, for you, the relationship between reality, depicting reality and bringing it out, and possibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's always the dance that you play. And in no way, I think, I'm extremely critical of graffiti. I celebrate it. I think I learn so much from it, but I'm also critical of some of the things I see. So I have to put that out there. I think being a product or being a student of that space, being a student of what graffiti at its best represents, like you said, it represents this type of ground up communication. You know, in the public spaces is not void of communication. We see this very top down communication where if you have money to pay for a billboard, if you can do this, then you can communicate to the public and no one asks questions. And I think graffiti at its best exists as a way of saying people will always speak back to you, or people will always speak or show that they're present in those spaces. I think that question of hope in the midst of despair, or having hope in the midst of being truthful, is definitely something that all artists have to be conscious of. You have to be that mirror. You have to be like Nina Simone said, and be, how she said it, artist, it's an artist's duty to reflect the times. So you have to be that mirror. But I think in the context of being a mirror, you also have to be a prisoner of hope. You have to understand that your ability as an artist is to paint what could be as well. And sometimes that's just a matter of collaborating with the voices of the people. Because I think the hope has always been around us. You know, it's not like the artist has the weight of hope, but in most times it's for me just to listen to how an elder is interpreting hope and being able to translate that to a painting. But it's definitely a dance that occurs. You don't want to just paint all the wrong. Somehow you got to show that we all have a responsibility to envision what things could be.
One of your exhibits, your first exhibit in Studio B, perhaps, was called Ephemeral Eternal.
Yeah.
Another of the qualities, the characteristics of your art form is that it is very often intended to be mortal, to be impermanent. What do you think, what does impermanence give to your art?
I think impermanence gives a sense of urgency. I think it gives a sense of, you know, when I was in high school, a friend of mine had this epiphany. He was like, I know why we paint. I went to this art high school in New Orleans, and he's like, I know why we paint. We want to be immortal. We want our work to live forever. And that discouraged me, because every time I approached the canvas, I asked that question, does this deserve to last forever? And painting in the public space gave me peace and gave me liberation, because I knew whatever I painted couldn't last forever. And so it gave that sense of security in a way. But I do think there is, I think that's more true to life, this idea that there are these ephemeral moments that happen, but somehow these moments are connected to an eternal thread. And so my painting doesn't have to last forever to connect to a thread that will. You know, this idea of love is definitely not ephemeral. You know, that's something that's going to last forever. And if I can allow a painting to spark a conversation that will connect to that internal thread, then I think that my job is done. It doesn't have to be on someone's wall forever and ever and ever and ever to do that. And I think that it gives us more urgency around the types of moments we celebrate. I mean, everything in here, in this space, the exhibit is all about moments of individuals that we celebrate. And I think it's easy for us to disconnect from that when we see it that way, when we see it as a painting on the wall. I think for me, the ephemeral nature is this challenge that says, this moment ended, and where do you begin with it? You know, how is this relay race, this baton being passed?
Yeah.
And I think that's the joy I have in painting these ephemeral things, because when someone sees it gone, it's like, okay, it's not gone because it's still in you, and how do we keep it moving? And that's true to history, I think. That's more true to life, this relay race of relay race of giants, relay race of responsibility, this relay race of just people who are charged with this mission to make the world a better place.
Right. Your work is filled with these dichotomies, reality and possibility, and one of them is between history and the future. So much of your work is in dialogue. It's referencing all of these, both visual references from history, but also you are depicting some of the people that actually made the communities that you're working in. Talk about how you learned some of the history of your place, and talk about how you're carrying that history forward into the future with programs like 2 Cent.
Yeah, I think for me, so I went to high school visual arts, and then I decided I was done with visual arts. I didn't see myself reflected. Long story short, I was just like, what am I going to do with knowing how to paint? And so I went to college for filmmaking, figured I would do more work as a filmmaker and be more impactful. After college, I got a job at this space called New Orleans Public Access Television. It's like a public access TV station. I sat behind the camera, and there's two main lanes that people go there. It was either religious programming or elders from the community who had a lot to say, who just wanted to get on their soapbox. And so I found myself, you know, my job was really to be behind the camera, but I think my job was also sitting at the feet of these elders. And it was from there that I began to have this fascination and appreciation for history, for not the national aspect of history, that this person from all the way over there did something, but they were teaching me that this woman that lived right there, she did something, or this elder that went over there, he did something. And I immediately saw space differently. I didn't see it as what it could be. I was more fascinated as what it was, you know, that this was a sacred ground because someone over there just walked past 10 years ago and did something amazing. And if anyway, the connection has been that the art has been allowed to do the same thing, that I can amplify those stories on those same walls that talk about what happened in the past. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it. I'm sorry. I'm like looking at this counter and I'm like, oh, I got to talk fast.
I think so. Part of the work that you do now is actually to enable, to the first image that we saw, is to enable kids to come in and engage with some of this history and make some images of their own. What is 2 Cent?
Yeah, I mean, there's an elder artist in New Orleans, no longer living, named John Scott, and he had this phrase called "pass it on," and I'm a big product of that. Like elders and people who took the time to pass it on to me. And I know that it's the moment that I have now. I don't know how long it will last, but the moment while people are paying attention, I'm conscious of being able to pass it on. And so 2 Cent, we have a summer program where we teach and engage youth, teenagers in the city to be able to be their own storytellers, whether it be through media or through art. And that's the whole goal. I mean, to continue to make sure that this doesn't end with us, that this doesn't end now, that this has a long continuum, that people are bold enough to tell their truth and to speak their story.
B. Mike, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, B. Mike. Thank you, Matt. Thank you to all our speakers and moderators today. Thanks again to the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge for its support of the festival. Thanks to the National Portrait Gallery, and most of all, thank you all for being here for a very special afternoon. 2 quick announcements. We'd love it if you could join us at the Booz Allen Hamilton Innovation Zone for cocktails until 6. And after that, the festival closing event will be a special screening of the soon-to-be-released major motion picture, Widows. So you don't want to miss that. Thank you for all coming.